Coming up this time, stories from Cloughie's first steps into management.
Just the sheer dedication, the way he threw himself at the job.
Adapting to the unusual training facilities.
The flat surface of the beach was actually not a bad place to train. The problem was the wind and the cold, but it was a good surface for 5-side games.
And how the players adapted to their new boss.
They'd never met somebody like Clough before, and they've never met somebody like him since. I think that's a common thing with all the players that played under him. Well, he was a one-off.
Marcus, good afternoon to you. It's not a very good afternoon, actually. It's pouring down, but it's nice to see you. I've got my grandchildren, I've got holidays, I've got lanes to walk down, I've got your lovely smiling face to look at on a Saturday, God forbid.
You're listening to the Green Jumper podcast with myself, Marcus Alton, the editor of the tribute website brianclough.com. And my guest today is the author of a book all about Cloughie's first managerial job in the Football League, at Hartlepools, as it was known then. We'll come on to the reason why it was plural in a little while. But first of all, welcome along to the author of the book, Alchemy, Chris Hull. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me, Marcus.
And as a Hartlepool fan, this book must have been an absolute labour of love for you.
Oh, definitely, yeah. It's something that I've had in the back of my mind for a long time, and finally just saw an opportunity to sort of delve a little bit further into his time at Hartlepools. And you just get sucked in by the story, really, and it's Cloughie. So yeah. There's only one Cloughie, completely unique character, and found himself in a unique set of circumstances, both personal and football-wise, when it came to Hartlepool. And it was just I mean, anything with Clough is a good story. I think the thing that attracted me here was it's a story that interested me, and I think a lot of people don't know too much about, apart from a few basic things about him learning to drive the bus, the team coach, things like that. And that's where he started his career. Although you ask a lot of people, and this is something I used to do as a fan, they say, "Oh, what football club do you support?" Because I'm not from Hartlepool, I'm from London. You can probably tell from my accent.
Yes.
I'll say, "Oh, I support the club where Brian Clough began his managerial career." And a lot of people sort of pause for a moment, and they say, "Derby, Sunderland," and only generally people from the northeast or people who know a lot about Clough will know that it was Hartlepool, or Hartlepools as it was known.
And of course, when he joined the club, it was a huge challenge at the time, because they were fighting re-election each season, or more or less each season, and the state of the club was terrible, wasn't it? A ramshackle stadium. It really was starting at the bottom.
Yeah, there's an interesting parallel, really, a sort of triple parallel in terms of Clough personally, because his playing career had ended so tragically for him. It was a personal tragedy. He was really at the height of his powers, 27 years old. Always says that sort of season and a half that he was at Sunderland were his happiest days, the happiest days of his playing career. And then really in a moment, his career basically ended. He played another 3 games a year and a half later, but that was the end of his playing career. Heartbroken. Yes. So down on his luck. And if truth be told, at home with one child, another on the way at the point that he took over the job at Hartlepools, and that was Nigel.
Yes.
He was born in March of 66. And, football was all he knew. Football was all he was skilled in. Hadn't done that well academically at school. So football was his only profession. So he was down on his luck. Hartlepools United, the football club, were down on their luck because they'd applied for re-election to the Football League in 5 out of the previous 6 seasons. And to add to that, the town, or the twin towns of Hartlepool and West Hartlepool, were also down on their luck because industrially, economically, they were on the way down. Their peak really, well, I mean, go into it and say that their peak was probably pre-First World War, but there'd been a little bit of a boom after the Second World War. But by the early 60s, the town industrially was on the way down. That was partly to do with the mining industry. The last shipyard had closed in Hartlepool in 1962. So you got that triple down on their luck parallel going on.
Yes.
And football-wise, football's biggest challenge, Hartlepool, without exaggeration, you could say at that point in the 1960s, they were the worst team in the Football League based on the results in the previous 6 seasons.
Yes, yeah. And the stadium itself was so dilapidated with leaking roofs. And one amusing thing I got from your book was some fans writing to the local paper about flakes of rust falling on them when players hit wayward shots. And there was one of them asked, could the manager either replace the corrugated sheeting or instruct his players to shoot more accurately?
Interesting, that corrugated sheeting, as you mentioned it. That corrugated sheeting, this isn't in the book actually. I've read somewhere, and I'm pretty sure it's true just because of the shape of that roof, was made from old Anderson shelters. The stadium then, and it was still, there was one side or the main wooden stand, which was the only seated area in the Victoria ground, which covered 1/3 the length of one touchline, made of wood, leaky, as you said, a boardroom into which Clough placed buckets to catch the drips of rain, his office no bigger than his downstairs toilet at home, the away dressing room, but not the home dressing room. The home dressing room, and this was still the case when I first went in 1979, was basically 2 army barracks huts knocked together and turned into a home dressing room.
Wow.
But like you say, the rink end roof was made from old Anderson shelter. So by the 1960s, 20 years after the end of the Second World War, those Anderson shelter sheets had started to were well rusted.
Yes.
And so, but Brian Clough said that on a rainy day, the spectators would place themselves in parts of the terrace where there was not a hole in the roof above, and you can actually see in photo and video of the time the holes in the roof, and because it was curved at the front. That's where I'm imagining that the ball used to hit. Whenever I went over the crossbar, would hit that curved bit at the front and shower the fans with rust.
Yeah.
And so they were getting quite browned off by it all. Yeah.
And the team wasn't much better than the ones that he inherited. I know he said that, looking back, he said that the team lacked so much talent that the only thing the midfield could create was confusion among themselves. So he had a big job to do on the pitch, didn't he?
He did have a big job to do on the pitch, but I think Clough and Taylor were fortunate in a couple of regards, and that was that just prior to them, Jeff Twentyman, who he only lasted 4 months in the job, and 2 of those were close season months. So basically, the first 2 months of the season, he had brought a couple of players who turned out to be extremely useful. And actually, the manager prior to Jeff Twentyman, Alvin Williams, who scarpered to South to manage Southend, he had brought in his last act as Hartlepool's manager was to bring in this chap called Ernie Fithian, who knew where the back of the net was. Yeah. Jeff Twentyman took over and he brought in Jimmy Mulvaney from Whitby Town. And in that second season that Clough and Taylor were in charge, between them, they were a dynamic duo in terms of the number of goals they scored. So both of those players they inherited. So while Clough and Taylor said some quite unkind things about the squad, there were a few nuggets there that did well for them.
Which is a bit like what they went on to manage at Derby and Forest. That at the City Ground there was John Robertson and Martin O'Neill already there, not really doing much at the time, but they turned them into world beaters.
That's it. That's what they were known for. That's what they were known for. They started that at Hartlepool. Extracting the best or being spotting in somebody talent that nobody else had spotted, or putting them in a position on the pitch, which was the case with John Robinson, wasn't it, where they could fully exploit their talents. And John McGovern was another one, because obviously John McGovern was somebody that started under them at Hartlepools, but when they went to Derby, they changed. He was moved into the middle of the park, whereas at Hartlepools he was an inside right, but quite a slow one.
Now, getting players to eat the right food is not something that automatically comes to mind when you think of Clough's management style, but you came across quite a few stories of how players were actually put on diets to make sure they weren't overweight. And I think one of them you spoke to was Ken Simpkins, the goalkeeper.
That's right, Ken Simpkins. I mean, in a sense, I feel a little bit bad about continually mentioning his weight, but the reason I do that is because whenever Ken Simpkins' name appeared in the local newspaper, which at the time was called the Northern Daily Mail, or its Saturday evening edition, the Football Mail, if it wasn't about mentioning action on the pitch, it was always about Ken Simpkins and his fight, his fight against the flab, and taking off weight, then putting it back on again.
Yeah.
And after they left, actually, he had a plastic suit, so that sort of made of bin bags, one of the other players told me, so that he sweat inside the suit. But the unfortunate thing is that their local training facility, which wasn't a training ground, but the local beach or a number of local beaches, was especially in the winter, as Clough has famously said, the coldest place on earth, so not the best place in the world to get a sweat on.
No, not indeed. And they did have to train on the beach, didn't they?
That's it. If the pitch was a little bit soft, which was, of course, the case for much of the season, then it was the beach. The flat surface of the beach was actually not a bad place to train. The problem was the wind and the cold, but it was a good surface for 5 side games, the players told me.
Yeah. And just coming back to Ken Simpkins, the goalkeeper, he did successfully lose weight, didn't he? At one point, he was called in every other day to be weighed on the scales, I think, which sounds quite, draconian, really.
Yeah, it was like I say, it's quite a humorous story in a way. Without wanting to be sizist.
Yeah.
But I mean, the slightly comical thing was that they literally had the heaviest goalkeeper in the Football League and also the shortest in Les Green.
And of course, it all came down to fitness, really, and making sure that they were as fit as they possibly could be. Because I think he said, fitness was crucial certainly in the final 15 minutes of a match. So it was all well intended at the time. Another thing I noticed, and it comes into that alchemy theme of building a great team spirit, which is what they went on to do again at Derby and Nottingham Forest. And I noticed in your book, Jimmy Mulvaney quoted as saying he'd run through fire for Brian Clough, which is something a lot of players have said since.
That's it. I think I mentioned John McGovern. John McGovern is quoted as saying he would have walk across the Sahara for him. Yeah. Other players run through a brick wall.
Yes.
Yeah, it was that man management that Clough had. He was able to extract the best out of individual players and provoke them in the right places and at the right time to G them up and basically extract their best and turn, the theme of alchemy, both on a club level, team level, and on an individual level, turning a base metal into gold or into silverware, literally. Bringing silverware to Derby and Nottingham Forest, two unfashionable lower second division teams when they took over, turning them into trophy winners. Bringing the European Cup twice to Nottingham is just an amazing feat.
Yeah. It's certainly great hearing and reading the stories of former players, back in the 60s. And I remember Terry Bell, who's sadly no longer with us, a Hartlepool player, told me he accidentally poured a bucket of water over Cloughie when a prank went wrong, and that's in one of my books. But you've spoken to quite a few of the former players there, and it must have been very special for you to hear their memories directly. Are there any that stand out for you?
The common theme among them was that in a sense there was no actual surprise when it came to Clough at Hartlepools, in terms of he was the same player at Hartlepools that they later saw on the telly.
Yeah.
And, in charge of Derby and Nottingham Forest. It was the same Clough, a younger version of him. The other thing was that, together from the very beginning, that when they walked into the club, and obviously Taylor had managed for a few years at non-league Burton Albion, whereas with Clough it was his first managerial job. They knew what they were doing. Do you know what I mean? They didn't they didn't feel like novices to them. They knew exactly what they do. They had a plan. They had a strategy, and their talents really dovetailed in a good way. But it was only really when they got to the end of that first season, because they took over basically a third of the way into the 65-66 season with Hartlepools second bottom, managed just for the team to escape re-election. It was only during that first summer, the summer of 66, obviously the year that England won the World Cup, they were able to mould the team into something approaching a Clough and Taylor team. And, they had an outside, at one point they were in the top four, a couple of points during that season, only through lack of money.
Yes.
Really, and according to Taylor, one particular player that they tried to recruit in the summer of 66 and didn't manage to. Only because of that did they finish 8th and not in the top 4. And and obviously the manager that followed them when they went to Derby in the summer of 67, Angus MacLean, inherited a very good team, and only thanks to what he'd inherited from Clough and Taylor was, he was no fool. But he'd never got promotion if he hadn't inherited such a decent squad from Clough and Taylor.
They laid the foundations really, and to finish eighth with what they'd got was quite an achievement, really.
You could almost argue, Marcus, that given their recent history prior to them taking over, that getting Hartlepools up to 8th place was almost as much as an achievement as winning the league championship at Derby and then Nottingham Forest and 2 European Cups. It was an achievement in itself. If you just look at the history of Hartlepools prior to that, they were not doing well.
Yeah,
doing well at all. In fact, in the bottom two, from the 59-60 season until the 63-64 season, they finished in the bottom 2 for 5 seasons running.
And with that lack of resources, lack of money, you've mentioned the photo of Cloughie at the wheel of the team coach, although I don't think he actually drove it himself in the end. But he became a one-man fundraising machine, didn't he, really, when they were having to get local organisations to help donate money.
Just the sheer, the dedication, the way he threw himself at the job was something that impresses me in terms of, he was managing the football team, which was a tough challenge in itself. But when it came to that second season, he was working 18-hour days. He was hardly seeing his children. His wife said, quoted as saying, how many meals she threw away because he would only get home for the late night television epilogue.
Yes,
he was a manager. He was on the training pitch, which was the local beach. He was, and then from November 66 onwards, when the chairman resigned for the umpteenth time, and the rest of the board called his bluff and accepted his resignation, the club was at serious risk of going out of business, and Clough literally went round every single working man's club in the Hartlepools, and a lot of pubs as well, fundraising. So he was the sort of manager by day, fundraiser by night, as well as drumming up great publicity with the local paper. For example, that picture of him, as you said, learning to drive the team coach. In the summer of 66, there's a picture in my book of him with a hammer, dressed in overalls with a hammer in his hand, got involved in repairing the stands and painting the stands. And a man of all the talents, really throwing himself at the job. By hook or by crook, he was going to make it work.
And with all that there was often turmoil behind the scenes, as you explain it in the book. He certainly had a bumpy journey with the chairman, Ernie Ord, didn't he?
That's right. That's right. I think you can definitely draw parallels between Ernie Ord at Hartlepools and Sam Longson at Derby County
Yeah.
in terms of the type of men they were. They were, self-made men, self-made millionaires. Both drove a Rolls Royce, and they both had an enormous falling out with Cloughie. Both being headstrong people. Clough wasn't one to mince his words and not to call a spade a garden digging implement, and the same went for the chairman. So
yes.
So yeah, the first in a long line of disagreements with the board.
Yes, but he did end up having a good relationship with the chairman who took over from Ernie, or John Curry.
John Curry, that's right.
And I think in hindsight, he said, well, he didn't interfere with my job. He let me get on with it. And I thought what was really nice that you include is that Clough and Taylor presented him with a farewell gift when they went to Derby.
That's it. They gave him a lighter with an inscription saying, "We'll never work for a better football manager." Well, one of the people I managed to catch up with a bit of detective work was John Curry's son, actually.
Oh yeah,
who's John Curry Jr., who's still with us and living in Canada. So I had a few good chats with John about his dad, and is interested in the car he drove. And but no, it's actually quite sad when you get to the end of that second season, which was the only full season they were in charge. Trying to imagine that phone call that Clough made to John Curry to say, "Look, really sorry, but I'm leaving."
Yes,
it's
after
like,
all that,
after all those years of struggle on the pitch, and then John Curry takes over from Ernie Ord. Clough does all that fundraising. They get them up to 8th. Real ambition to get promotion that next season, which of course they subsequently did under a different manager. And then Derby come calling, and Clough and Taylor thresh it out in the snooker room of a hotel in Scarborough, and Taylor manages to persuade Clough, because Clough was resistant to leaving. That's quite clear.
Yeah.
Taylor couldn't get out of Hartlepools quick enough. Down to Derby, which is obviously his neck of the woods, the East Midlands, coming from Nottingham. But Clough had a little bit more of an attachment. Obviously, he's from the Northeast himself, and had been round to all these working men's clubs, extracting money from working class folk. And you can imagine some of the conversations why should I give money to this club? You're here today, could be gone tomorrow. They'll only sink back to the bottom of the Football League, but managed to extract money, managed to keep the club going. And then it didn't sit right with him. I'm leaving. I think his attitude was, let's get the job finished, let's get promotion, and then we'll leave. But Taylor said, no, we might not get another opportunity like this. It's Derby County, team of former glories. Let's go now. We're leaving Hartlepools in a better shape than we found it. We might regret it if we don't take this opportunity. And I don't think it took him long to persuade Clough, but he was resistant initially to leaving, whereas Taylor couldn't get out fast enough.
Yeah. Well, give him credit. Ernie Ord was right, really, because at one stage he's praising Clough as the best manager around, and saying he's so good, he'll soon be off to another club. So the writing was on the wall, I guess, to a certain extent. But another thing I liked when I read it was, although they went to Derby, Cloughie always had a soft spot for Hartlepool. By then, the two boroughs were united, so it was Hartlepool instead of Hartlepools. And when the club was again in dire straits, he bought a player from them, even though he didn't need them.
That's it. I think that was repaying a favour to John Curry. I think it was a tax demand, something like that, something that had to be paid very quickly.
Yeah.
And Curry rang Clough and said, can you help me out here? Buy one of our players, and the player that they bought was Tony Parry, and that money saved the club from extinction, from going bankrupt.
Yeah, which is amazing. And I think Tony Parry was one of the first, or if not the first, signing they'd made at Hartlepools. So there was a sort of the full circle being made there. What's your lasting memory of Clough from all the work that you've done on the book?
Ooh, just how unique, just, what a one-off character he was. This is something else that the players said to me, actually. General message was they'd never met somebody like Clough before, and they've never met somebody like him since. So I think that's a common thing with all the players that played under him.
Yes.
He was a one-off. He was a one-off, and you never knew what you were going to get. Like John Motson has said that in his Great Lives BBC Four episode, where he chose Brian Clough as the great life to study. You never knew on a match or even any other day what Clough you were going to get. He was just so unpredictable.
Exactly.
Only one Cloughie.
Well, there are details of the book Alchemy on the show notes for this episode and on the Brian Clough Tribute website. But for now, Chris Hull, thanks very much for joining us today.
Thanks so much for having me, Marcus.
And once again, thanks to you for listening. It's wonderful to see the podcast downloaded in so many countries. Don't forget, there are more Cloughie stories on brianclough.com, where you can also buy books and souvenirs supporting good causes. I hope you can join me next time when we'll share more memories of the great man in the green jumper.